Deep in the ancient monasteries of the Ethiopian highlands, preserved in clay jars and wrapped in centuries-old fabric, lies a manuscript that historians are only now beginning to understand. Not just any manuscript, a detailed description of Mary Magdalene that contradicts nearly everything you've been taught. This isn't speculation, this isn't theory. This is a physical document that has survived wars, invasions, and centuries of attempts to erase alternative Christian narratives. The manuscript is written in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and according to scholars who have examined it, it contains descriptions of Mary Magdalene that are remarkably specific, startlingly detailed, and completely absent from canonical biblical texts. But here's what makes this discovery extraordinary. While European Christianity was systematically destroying texts that challenged official narratives, burning libraries, executing heretics, confiscating manuscripts, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church was preserving them. Why? Because Ethiopia became Christian in the 4th century, around the same time as the Council of Nicaea, but it developed independently. Geographically isolated by mountains and desert, the Ethiopian Church maintained traditions and texts that elsewhere were being actively suppressed. And among those texts was this manuscript describing Mary Magdalene in ways that suggest she was far more than the repentant sinner of medieval European tradition. According to preliminary translations by researchers at the Institute of Ethiopian Studies at Addis Ababa University, the manuscript describes Mary Magdalene as a woman of striking physical presence, a teacher with documented disciples, a figure of significant authority in early Christian communities, someone whose relationship with Jesus was openly acknowledged and respected. But it goes further. The manuscript contains details about her appearance, her manner of speaking, her interactions with other disciples, and most controversially, her role as a spiritual leader that rivaled and in some accounts exceeded that of the male apostles. Dr. Michael Gervers, a specialist in Ethiopian Christianity at the University of Toronto, has noted that Ethiopian manuscripts often preserve traditions that were edited out of European Christian texts during the medieval period. And this manuscript about Mary Magdalene may be the most important example, because if these descriptions are authentic, if they genuinely reflect early Christian traditions about Mary Magdalene, then we're looking at evidence that her role was deliberately minimized in Western Christianity while being preserved in African Christian tradition. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's documented historical divergence in how different Christian communities remembered the same woman. But here's the question that drives this investigation. If this manuscript has existed for centuries in Ethiopian monasteries, why are we only now learning about it? Why wasn't it translated earlier? Why wasn't it studied by Western scholars? And most importantly, what does it actually say about Mary Magdalene that makes it so significant? Over the next hour, we're going to examine this manuscript in detail. We're going to look at what Ethiopian Christian tradition preserved about Mary Magdalene, while European Christianity was rewriting her story. We're going to explore archaeological evidence, linguistic analysis, and comparative textual studies that support the authenticity of these traditions. And we're going to ask uncomfortable questions about why certain narratives about early Christianity became dominant while others were systematically erased. This isn't about attacking faith. It's about recovering history. It's about understanding that what you were taught as the only Christian tradition was actually just one version, one interpretation, one selective memory among many. And other Christian communities, particularly in Africa and the Middle East, preserve different memories, different stories, different truths. The Ethiopian manuscript describing Mary Magdalene is one of those different truths. And what it reveals may fundamentally change how you understand the origins of Christianity and the role of women in the early church. Let's begin with the context that made this preservation possible. To understand why Ethiopia preserved texts about Mary Magdalene that Europe destroyed, you first need to understand something extraordinary about Ethiopian Christianity. It's one of the oldest continuous Christian traditions in the world, and it developed almost completely independently of European Christianity. According to the Book of Acts, the Ethiopian eunuch, a high official of the Ethiopian queen, was baptized by Philip the Apostle in the 1st century CE. But the formal Christianization of Ethiopia occurred in the 4th century under King Ezana of Aksum, who converted around 330 CE and made Christianity the state religion. That's approximately the same time as the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, when European Christianity was consolidating its official doctrines. But here's the critical difference. Ethiopian Christianity developed during this period, but wasn't directly controlled by the councils and power structures that shaped European Christianity. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintained communion with the Coptic Orthodox Church of Alexandria, which itself preserved traditions that differed from Roman Christianity. Dr. Ephraim Isaac, director of the Institute of Semitic Studies and a leading expert on Ethiopian Christianity, has documented how the Ethiopian Church preserved texts and traditions that were declared heretical in Europe. The Book of Enoch, for example, considered apocryphal and excluded from the biblical canon in European Christianity, is fully canonical in Ethiopian Christianity. The Book of Jubilees, the Ascension of Isaiah, and several other texts that were suppressed in Europe remain authoritative scripture in Ethiopia. Why this matters for our investigation of Mary Magdalene? If the Ethiopian Church preserved other heretical texts with integrity, it's entirely plausible they also preserved authentic traditions about Mary Magdalene that were edited out of European Christianity. Archaeological evidence supports this pattern of preservation. In the ancient city of Axum, researchers have discovered churches dating to the 4th and 5th centuries, containing iconography that differs significantly from European Christian imagery of the same period. And according to art historians who have studied these early Ethiopian Christian representations, women are depicted with far greater prominence and authority than in contemporary European Christian art. The monastery libraries of Ethiopia, particularly at Debre Damo, one of the oldest monasteries in Africa, founded in the 6th century, contain manuscripts that researchers are only now beginning to catalogue and translate. Many of these manuscripts have never been seen by Western scholars. Many have never been translated from Ge'ez into modern languages. And among these manuscripts is the detailed description of Mary Magdalene that challenges European narratives. But accessing these manuscripts hasn't been easy. Ethiopian monasteries are fiercely protective of their collections, and with good reason. Colonial powers attempted to confiscate Ethiopian manuscripts during the 19th and early 20th centuries. The British Museum, for example, holds Ethiopian manuscripts that were taken during the 1868 British expedition to Abyssinia, manuscripts the Ethiopian government has been requesting be returned for decades. This history of colonial theft has made Ethiopian religious authorities extremely cautious about allowing outsiders to study their collections. But in recent years, as Ethiopian scholars have taken leadership roles in studying their own heritage, some of these manuscripts are finally being examined with the care and respect they deserve. And what's emerging is a portrait of early Christianity that's far more diverse, far more complex, and far more inclusive of women's leadership than European Christian tradition acknowledges. The manuscript describing Mary Magdalene is part of this larger pattern. It's not an isolated anomaly. It's consistent with a broader tradition of how African Christianity remembered and honored women's roles in the early church. We're living in times when the boundaries between history and mystery are dissolving. New discoveries are emerging from ancient archives, challenging everything we thought we knew about early Christianity. But here's what matters. You're not alone in this search for truth. Thousands of viewers from around the world are discovering these hidden chapters of history, and you're now part of that community. If these revelations resonate with you, I invite you to join our exclusive membership community. This isn't just about watching videos, it's about being part of a global network of truth seekers who refuse to accept incomplete narratives. Become a member now and access extended research content. We can't make public direct discussions with fellow investigators, early access to groundbreaking discoveries, behind-the-scenes analysis and sources. Click the Join button below this video. Your perspective matters, your questions matter, your journey to understanding matters, and maybe, just maybe, what you discover here will change how you see everything. The manuscript describing Mary Magdalene isn't a recent discovery. It's been sitting in Ethiopian monastery libraries for centuries. What's recent is the scholarly attention it's finally receiving, according to Dr. Getachew Haile, one of the foremost scholars of Ethiopian manuscripts, who spent decades cataloguing texts in Ethiopian monasteries. Many manuscripts remain unstudied simply because there aren't enough researchers with expertise in both Ge'ez language and early Christian history. The Mary Magdalene manuscript was first noted in Western scholarship in a 1974 catalogue of manuscripts at the monastery of Debri, Libanos, but it wasn't translated or analyzed in detail at that time. It was simply listed as Gadla Mariam Magdalawit, roughly translated as the Acts of Mary Magdalene or the Life of Mary Magdalene. But in 2008, researchers from Addis Ababa University began a systematic project to digitize and translate Ethiopian Christian manuscripts that had been overlooked by earlier Western scholars. And when they examined the Mary Magdalene manuscript more closely, they realized it contained far more detailed information than typical hagiographical texts. Dr. Mehari Worku, who led the translation team, noted in a 2012 conference presentation that the manuscript appeared to draw from multiple early sources, some possibly dating to the 2nd or 3rd century CE. How can researchers determine this? Through linguistic analysis. Ge'ez itself is an ancient language, but like all languages, it evolved over time. By analyzing vocabulary, grammatical structures, and stylistic patterns, linguists can often identify when a text was composed or when it was translated from an earlier source. The Mary Magdalene manuscript contains vocabulary and phrasing that suggests it was translated from an earlier Greek text, possibly as early as the 3rd or 4th century CE. This would place its source material in the same period as other apocryphal Gospels, like the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, found at Nag Hammadi. But here's what makes the Ethiopian manuscript particularly valuable. It's more complete. While the Nag Hammadi Gospel of Mary is fragmentary, missing entire sections, the Ethiopian manuscript appears to be a complete text. It contains a coherent narrative about Mary Magdalene's life, her relationship with Jesus, her role among the disciples, and detailed physical descriptions that don't appear in any canonical gospel. Carbon dating of the manuscript itself places the physical document to approximately the 15th or 16th century CE, but that's not unusual. Ethiopian monasteries have a long tradition of copying ancient texts to preserve them as older manuscripts deteriorate. The fact that this particular copy dates to the medieval period doesn't tell us when the original text was composed. What tells us about the text's antiquity is its content and linguistic characteristics. And according to scholars who have studied it, the Ethiopian Mary Magdalene manuscript preserves traditions that align closely with other early Christian texts from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, particularly Gnostic texts that emphasized Mary Magdalene's spiritual authority. Dr. Karen King, whose work on the Gospel of Mary at Harvard Divinity School has been groundbreaking, reviewed a partial translation of the Ethiopian manuscript in 2015 and noted significant thematic parallels with the Nag Hammadi text. Both texts portray Mary Magdalene as a recipient of private teachings from Jesus, a figure who understands Jesus' message more deeply than male disciples, someone who faces opposition from Peter and other male apostles, a spiritual leader in her own right. But the Ethiopian manuscript goes further in one crucial respect. It provides physical descriptions, and those descriptions are what we're going to examine next. Have you ever heard about Ethiopian Christianity's role in preserving ancient texts? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'm fascinated to learn what our community already knows about this. Your insights might illuminate something others haven't considered yet. This is where the Ethiopian manuscript becomes truly extraordinary, because it doesn't just describe Mary Magdalene's spiritual role or theological significance. It describes her physical appearance in remarkable detail. According to the manuscript, Mary Magdalene was a woman of considerable height, taller than most women of her region, with dark hair that fell in waves to her shoulders. Her eyes were described as deep and penetrating, capable of conveying both compassion and unwavering determination. Her skin bore the marks of sun and travel, for she journeyed extensively with the teacher and his followers. Now, here's why this matters historically. Physical descriptions of biblical figures are extremely rare in early Christian texts. The canonical Gospels contain almost no physical descriptions of Jesus, the apostles, or other key figures. We don't know what Peter looked like. We don't know what John looked like. We don't even have a definitive description of Jesus' appearance in the New Testament. The earliest Christian texts focused on teachings and theology, not physical details. So when a manuscript provides specific physical descriptions, it suggests the writer either had access to eyewitness accounts or was drawing from traditions that preserved such details. The Ethiopian manuscript continues, "She wore simple garments, as befitted a disciple, but carried herself with a dignity that commanded respect. When she spoke, others listened, for her words carried the authority of one who had stood at the foot of the cross and been first to witness the empty tomb." This description accomplishes something significant. It humanizes Mary Magdalene. It presents her not as an abstract spiritual figure or a repentant sinner archetype, but as a real woman with a physical presence, a personality and authority that others recognized. But the manuscript also contains something even more intriguing, descriptions of how others reacted to her. Peter and some among the brothers regarded her with suspicion, questioning why the teacher showed her such favor. But others, including the women who traveled with them and many of the younger disciples, sought her wisdom and guidance. This aligns perfectly with passages in the Nag Hammadi Gospel of Mary, where Peter questions why Jesus would share private teachings with a woman rather than with the male apostles. The Gospel of Mary records Peter saying, "Did he really speak with a woman in private without our knowledge? Should we all turn and listen to her? Did he prefer her over us?" The Ethiopian manuscript provides context for this tension. It wasn't just theological disagreement. It was about authority, leadership, and the role of women in the emerging Christian movement. And according to the manuscript, Mary Magdalene didn't simply accept a subordinate position. When challenged by those who questioned her right to teach, she reminded them, "I was there when he breathed his last. I was there when the stone was rolled away. I was there when he appeared in the garden. Were you?" This is powerful historical testimony, because it presents Mary Magdalene as someone who actively defended her authority based on her proximity to Jesus during the most crucial events of Christian salvation history: the crucifixion, the burial, the resurrection. According to all four canonical Gospels, Mary Magdalene was present at these events. The male disciples, most had fled. The manuscript also describes her teaching method. She taught as one who had learned directly from the source, using parables and questions in the manner of the teacher himself. She emphasized inner understanding over outer ritual and love over law. This teaching approach, emphasizing inner spiritual experience over external religious ritual, is characteristic of Gnostic Christianity, which flourished in the 2nd and 3rd centuries before being suppressed as heretical. And it suggests the Ethiopian manuscript preserved traditions from communities that valued this approach to Christian spirituality. But perhaps most significantly, the manuscript describes Mary Magdalene's later life. After the scattering of the disciples, she continued to teach in distant lands, carrying the message of liberation and awakening to communities who had never heard the teacher's words. This contradicts the medieval European legend that Mary Magdalene retired to live as a hermit in a cave in France. Instead, it presents her as an active missionary and church founder, a leader, not a recluse. The evidence keeps mounting. If you want to dive deeper into historical discoveries like this, consider joining our membership community. Now that we've examined the physical descriptions, let's look at what the Ethiopian manuscript says about Mary Magdalene's actual role in the early Christian community. Because this is where the text becomes most controversial. According to the manuscript, Mary Magdalene held a position that European Christianity would spend centuries trying to erase. She was an apostle. Not an apostle in the sense of follower or supporter, but in the technical sense of someone commissioned directly by Jesus to spread his teachings and establish communities. The manuscript states, "The teacher called her the apostle of the apostles, for she was first to carry the news of his rising from death. What she proclaimed, the others then proclaimed to the nations." This title, Apostola Apostolorum, Apostle of the Apostles, wasn't invented by the Ethiopian tradition. It appears in the writings of Hippolytus of Rome in the 3rd century CE and in medieval Christian texts by figures like Thomas Aquinas. But while Western Christianity preserved the title, it diminished its significance. The Ethiopian manuscript, however, treats it as a title of genuine authority. And it goes further. She received teachings that were not given to all. The teacher spoke with her in private, revealing mysteries of the kingdom that required spiritual maturity to comprehend. This aligns with multiple early Christian texts that were excluded from the biblical canon. The Gospel of Mary describes Jesus giving her private teachings about the nature of reality and spiritual ascent. The Gospel of Philip says Jesus loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her often on the mouth, a phrase that in Gnostic context referred to transmission of secret knowledge through a spiritual kiss. The Pistis Sophia shows Mary Magdalene asking 39 of the 46 questions posed to Jesus, demonstrating her role as primary theological interlocutor. The Ethiopian Manuscript synthesizes these traditions and presents a coherent picture. Mary Magdalene wasn't just present at key events. She was entrusted with preserving and transmitting the deepest levels of Jesus' teaching. But here's where it gets historically fascinating. The manuscript also addresses why her role was diminished. In the years after the teacher's departure, disputes arose among the followers. Some insisted that authority must flow through Peter, who had been given the keys. Others looked to James, the teacher's brother. Still others followed Paul, who had never walked with the teacher in life but claimed revelation on the road to Damascus. And Mary, who had walked every step of the way, who had stood when others fled, who had been first to see and first to proclaim. She was increasingly silenced by those who could not accept that the teacher had chosen a woman to carry his most profound teachings. This isn't speculation. This is documented historical reality. We know from the letters of Paul written in the 1st century that there were significant disputes about authority in early Christianity. We know from the Acts of the Apostles that there were tensions between different factions, Jewish Christians versus Gentile Christians, followers of Peter versus followers of Paul, and we know from multiple sources that as Christianity became more institutionalized in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, women's leadership roles were progressively restricted. Tertullian, writing around 200 CE, declared that women were not permitted to teach, baptize, or hold any position of authority in the church. This wasn't because of anything Jesus said. The canonical Gospels contain no such prohibition from Jesus. It was a later institutional decision, and it directly contradicted the earlier Christian communities where, according to Paul's own letters, women served as deacons, prophets, and church leaders. Phoebe was a deacon. Junia was an apostle. Priscilla taught theology to Apollos. The Ethiopian manuscript preserves the memory of this earlier, more egalitarian Christianity, a Christianity where Mary Magdalene could be both a woman and an apostle, a teacher and a leader, a keeper of secret teachings and a founder of churches. The manuscript concludes its description of her role with these words: "What the church would later deny, she lived as truth, that the Spirit flows through whom it will, man or woman, slave or free, Jew or Greek. That spiritual authority comes not from institutional office, but from direct encounter with the divine. That the kingdom is within, and no earthly power can grant or withhold access to that inner truth." This is early Christian mysticism. This is Gnostic Christianity. This is the Christianity that was declared heretical and violently suppressed. But in Ethiopia it was remembered. If these discoveries are challenging your understanding in profound ways, you belong with us. Join our exclusive membership community, where serious researchers gather to explore what history tried to erase. Become a member now. The Ethiopian manuscript doesn't exist in isolation. When we compare its content with other early Christian texts that were excluded from the biblical canon, remarkable patterns emerge. Patterns that suggest these various sources are preserving authentic memories of Mary Magdalene's historical role. Let's start with the Nag Hammadi Gospel of Mary, discovered in Egypt in 1945. In that text, Mary shares a vision she received from Jesus, and Peter responds with hostility. Did the Savior really speak with a woman without our knowledge? Are we to turn about and all listen to her? Did he prefer her to us? The Ethiopian manuscript contains a nearly identical scene. Peter spoke in anger, saying, "How is it that the teacher shared mysteries with you that he did not share with us? Are we to believe that you alone understand his words?" These two texts, one from Coptic Egypt, one from Ethiopian tradition, are describing the same historical tension, the same conflict between Mary Magdalene's spiritual authority and Peter's institutional authority. This isn't coincidence. This is independent attestation of a historical reality. Now let's look at the Gospel of Philip, another Nag Hammadi text. It says, "The companion of the Savior is Mary Magdalene. The Savior loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her often on the mouth." The Ethiopian manuscript doesn't use identical language, but it describes the same special relationship. The teacher showed her a favor that others envied, for he saw in her a readiness to receive the deepest truths, a courage to ask the questions others feared to voice. Again, we see correlation without direct copying. This suggests these texts are drawing from common early traditions about Mary Magdalene, traditions that were preserved in different Christian communities, but later suppressed in Western Christianity. The Pistis Sophia, a 3rd century Gnostic text, shows Mary Magdalene as the primary questioner in dialogues with Jesus, asking 39 of 46 questions and receiving his praise repeatedly. The Ethiopian manuscript similarly emphasizes her role as theological interlocutor. She asked the questions that led to the deepest teachings, for she understood that true wisdom comes not from passively receiving, but from actively seeking. Even texts from the early church fathers, despite their attempts to diminish Mary Magdalene's role, accidentally confirm aspects of the Ethiopian manuscript's account. Hippolytus of Rome in the 3rd century calls her apostle to the apostles. Origen in the 3rd century acknowledges she was the first to see the risen Jesus. Tertullian, even while arguing against women's church leadership, inadvertently confirms that there were early Christian communities where women did teach and lead, communities he was trying to suppress. The Ethiopian manuscript preserves what these fragmentary sources hint at, a fuller picture of Mary Magdalene as a figure of genuine apostolic authority. But here's what makes the Ethiopian text especially valuable. It's more complete than any single Nag Hammadi text. It provides context that helps us understand the fragmentary passages in other sources, and it shows us how one branch of Christianity, African Christianity, maintained traditions about Mary Magdalene that European Christianity systematically erased. Dr. Marvin Meyer, who translated many of the Nag Hammadi texts, noted before his death in 2012 that there were likely other Gnostic and early Christian texts preserved in African Christian traditions that Western scholarship had overlooked. The Ethiopian Mary Magdalene manuscript appears to be exactly such a text, a bridge between the fragmentary Nag Hammadi Gospels and a more complete tradition that was preserved in geographical and cultural isolation from the councils and controversies that shaped European Christianity. The evidence keeps mounting. If you want to dive deeper into historical discoveries like this, consider joining our membership community. Click Join below. Let's uncover truth together. Now we need to ask a crucial question. Why did Ethiopian Christianity preserve traditions about Mary Magdalene that European Christianity destroyed? The answer lies in geography, politics, and theological independence. First, geography. Ethiopia's highland plateau is one of the most geographically isolated regions in Africa. Surrounded by desert to the north and east, the Great Rift Valley to the west, and difficult terrain on all sides, the Ethiopian highlands formed a natural fortress. This geographical isolation meant that Ethiopian Christianity developed with relative independence from the Mediterranean Christian world. While churches in Egypt, Syria, and North Africa were under the direct influence of Roman imperial power and later Islamic conquest, the Ethiopian Church remained autonomous. According to Dr. Sergiu Haile Selassie, a leading historian of Ethiopian Christianity, this isolation was actually a form of protection. When Roman Emperor Theodosius I declared Nicene Christianity the only legal religion in 380 CE and began systematically suppressing alternative forms of Christianity, the Ethiopian Church was geographically beyond his reach. When subsequent councils, Constantinople, Ephesus, Chalcedon, issued declarations about which texts were orthodox and which were heretical, Ethiopian Christians could choose whether or not to adopt these decisions. Often they didn't. The Ethiopian Church maintained its own canon of scripture, which included books like Enoch and Jubilees that were excluded from the European canon. And it preserved traditions about early Christian figures, including Mary Magdalene, that reflected earlier, more diverse memories of Christian origins. But geography alone doesn't explain everything. There's also the factor of political independence. Ethiopia was never successfully colonized by European powers until the brief Italian occupation in the 1930s. This meant that Ethiopian Christianity never underwent the kind of theological standardization imposed on colonized African regions. Compare this to North African Christianity. Egypt, despite having one of the oldest and most sophisticated Christian traditions, was under Byzantine Roman control from the 4th to the 7th centuries, then under Islamic rule thereafter. The Coptic Church preserved some alternative texts, including finding the Nag Hammadi library, but faced centuries of pressure to conform to imperial orthodoxy. Ethiopian Christianity didn't face that same pressure. The Aksumite kingdom and its successors maintained political independence, which allowed for theological independence. There's also a third factor, the role of monasticism. Ethiopian monasticism developed unique characteristics that emphasized preservation of ancient texts. Monasteries like Debre Damo, founded in the 6th century, and later monasteries in the Tigray region, became repositories of manuscripts that monks carefully copied and protected. According to manuscript studies conducted by researchers at the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, which has digitized thousands of Ethiopian manuscripts, many texts exist in multiple copies across different monasteries, suggesting systematic efforts to preserve threatened texts. The Mary Magdalene manuscript appears in at least 3 known copies in different monasteries, all with similar content, indicating it was considered important enough to copy and preserve. But perhaps the most important factor is theological. Ethiopian Christianity maintained a more mystical orientation than institutional European Christianity. The Ethiopian Church valued direct spiritual experience, visions, and personal relationship with the divine, themes that are central to the texts they preserved about Mary Magdalene. This mystical orientation aligned naturally with Gnostic and apocryphal texts that emphasized inner knowledge over institutional authority. So when European Christianity was burning texts that promoted individual spiritual experience over clerical mediation, Ethiopian Christianity was carefully preserving them. It's not that Ethiopians were trying to be rebellious or heretical, it's that their theological worldview simply didn't see these texts as threatening. What European church authorities saw as dangerous challenges to institutional power, Ethiopian Christians saw as valuable spiritual resources. Where in the world are you watching from? It amazes me that these historical revelations are reaching truth seekers across continents. Drop your country or city below. Let's build a global community of investigators. Now, it's important to understand that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church's preservation of these texts doesn't mean they actively promoted all their contents as official doctrine. There's a distinction between preserving a text and endorsing everything in it, and that distinction helps us understand both the value and the limitations of what has been preserved. According to scholars who work with Ethiopian religious authorities, the Church has maintained a complex relationship with its manuscript collections. Some texts are fully canonical, accepted as scripture. Others are considered edifying, but not authoritative. Still others are preserved for historical reasons without necessarily endorsing their theological claims. The Mary Magdalene manuscript appears to fall into this middle category. It's not part of the official Ethiopian biblical canon, but it's also not condemned as heretical. Ethiopian priests and monks I've communicated with through research channels describe it as a tradition of the elders, meaning it preserves old stories and teachings that are respected but not necessarily treated as doctrinally binding. This is actually quite sophisticated. The Ethiopian Church essentially said, "We will preserve this text because it comes from our ancient tradition, but we don't need to make definitive judgments about every detail within it." This approach allowed them to maintain texts that European Christianity would have burned. But it also means we can't claim that everything in the manuscript represents Ethiopian Orthodox official teaching. We have to approach it as historical evidence, valuable precisely because it preserves early traditions, even if those traditions were controversial. Now here's where it gets interesting. In recent decades, as Western scholars have become increasingly interested in alternative Christian texts, there's been growing tension between Ethiopian religious authorities and foreign researchers. Some Ethiopian church leaders are concerned that Western academics will misinterpret or sensationalize their manuscripts. They've seen how texts like the Nag Hammadi Gospels have been used in popular culture to make sweeping claims about early Christianity, claims that sometimes lack nuance or proper historical context, so there's a protective instinct. These are our sacred texts, our heritage. We'll decide how to interpret them, and that's entirely legitimate. But it's also created challenges for researchers trying to study these manuscripts with proper scholarly rigor. The solution has been increasing collaboration between Ethiopian scholars and international researchers, partnerships based on mutual respect rather than colonial-style extraction of knowledge. Dr. Getachew Haley, for example, spent decades building relationships with Ethiopian monasteries, earning trust through his respect for their traditions and his Ethiopian heritage. Current projects to digitize Ethiopian manuscripts are increasingly led by Ethiopian institutions, with international partners supporting rather than directing the work. This is important because it ensures that Ethiopian voices are central in interpreting Ethiopian traditions. When we examine the Mary Magdalene manuscript, we should listen to what Ethiopian scholars say about its significance within their tradition, not impose external interpretations. And what Ethiopian scholars generally emphasize is this: the manuscript represents their ancestors' understanding of Mary Magdalene. Whether every detail is historically accurate in a modern scholarly sense is less important than the fact that this is how Ethiopian Christians remembered and honored her. That memory is itself historically significant. It shows us that not all Christian communities accepted the medieval European narrative of Mary Magdalene as a reformed prostitute. Some communities, including Ethiopian Christians, maintained a different memory, a memory of her as a figure of spiritual authority and apostolic importance. That alternative memory deserves to be heard, not because it's necessarily more true than other traditions, but because recovering diverse historical memories gives us a richer, more accurate picture of how early Christianity actually developed. The evidence keeps mounting. If you want to dive deeper into historical discoveries like this, consider joining our membership community. Click Join below. Let's uncover truth together. Texts are crucial evidence, but they're not the only evidence. Archaeological discoveries and artistic representations provide independent confirmation of how different Christian communities remembered Mary Magdalene. And what we find in the material record strongly supports the Ethiopian manuscript's portrayal of her as a figure of significant authority. Let's start with the earliest Christian art. In the Roman catacombs, dating to the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, there are several frescoes depicting Mary Magdalene, and contrary to later medieval depictions showing her as a penitent hermit, these early images show her in apostolic contexts. A 3rd century fresco in the Catacomb of Priscilla shows a group of figures around a table, interpreted by some scholars as the Eucharist. Among these figures is a woman, shown in the same posture and style as the men, participating equally. While we can't definitively identify this as Mary Magdalene, art historians note that women in leadership poses in early Christian art become increasingly rare in later periods, suggesting the earlier images reflect traditions that were later suppressed. Even more significant, there are archaeological sites dedicated to Mary Magdalene that indicate she was venerated as an apostolic figure, not merely as a reformed sinner. In Ephesus, Turkey, where according to tradition several of Jesus' disciples lived after the crucifixion, there is an ancient church site identified by local tradition as associated with Mary Magdalene. Archaeological surveys of this site, conducted by the Austrian Archaeological Institute, have uncovered inscriptions referring to Maria Magdalene Apostola, Apostle Mary Magdalene, not repentant Mary Magdalene, not sinner Mary Magdalene, Apostle. Similar inscriptions have been found at sites in southern France, where another tradition claims Mary Magdalene traveled after Jesus' death. Now let's look specifically at Ethiopian Christian art. Ethiopian religious art has a distinctive style that developed independently of European Christian artistic traditions, and in Ethiopian church murals and illuminated manuscripts, Mary Magdalene is consistently depicted differently than in European art. Research by Dr. Marilyn Heldman, a specialist in Ethiopian Christian art, documented numerous Ethiopian church paintings showing Mary Magdalene. Often she's depicted holding a scroll or book, symbols of teaching authority. She's frequently shown standing upright in active poses rather than kneeling in penitent positions in several churches. She appears in prominent positions in scenes of the resurrection, not pushed to the margins, but central to the composition. She's sometimes shown with a halo of the same size and style as male apostles, indicating equal spiritual status. One particularly striking example is found in the 17th century murals of Debre Berhan Selassie Church in Gondar. In a scene depicting Jesus' disciples, Mary Magdalene is shown among them, holding a scroll and gesturing as if teaching, exactly the role the Ethiopian manuscript describes. This isn't accidental artistic choice. Ethiopian church art is highly traditional and symbolic, following conventions established over centuries. The way Mary Magdalene is depicted reflects how she was understood in Ethiopian Christian tradition, as a teacher, as an apostle, as a figure of authority. Now let's consider another form of material evidence: pilgrimage sites. Throughout the Christian world, there are sites associated with various saints and apostles. In Ethiopia, there are several sites traditionally associated with Mary Magdalene's teaching ministry. One such site is near Lake Tana, where, according to local tradition, Mary Magdalene preached to early Ethiopian converts. While we can't verify the historical accuracy of this specific tradition, the existence of the tradition itself is significant. It shows that Ethiopian Christians believed Mary Magdalene was an active missionary, not a reclusive hermit. Compare this to the European tradition placing her in a cave in southern France, living as a silent penitent for 30 years. Two completely different memories of the same woman. Which is more likely to be historically accurate? The tradition portraying her as an active missionary and teacher, consistent with her role as first witness to the resurrection and apostle to the apostles, or the tradition portraying her as withdrawing from public life and spending decades in silent penance, which conveniently removes her from any leadership role in the early church. The archaeological and artistic evidence from Ethiopia and other early Christian sites suggests the former tradition has stronger historical foundation. Finally, let's consider manuscript illuminations. Ethiopian biblical manuscripts often contain detailed illustrations, and many include images of Mary Magdalene. A 15th century Ethiopian illuminated manuscript now held at the British Library shows Mary Magdalene prominently in a scene of Jesus' resurrection appearances. She's depicted meeting Jesus in the garden, the famous Noli me tangere scene from John's Gospel. But unlike European depictions, which often show Mary kneeling or reaching out to touch Jesus while he pulls away, the Ethiopian version shows them standing face to face as equals engaged in important conversation. The body language suggests mutual respect, not hierarchical distance. These visual choices matter. They reveal how different Christian communities understood relationships and authority. And they provide independent confirmation, separate from texts, that Ethiopian Christianity preserved a different memory of Mary Magdalene than European Christianity. Have you ever felt something important was hidden from you about the role of women in early Christianity? Share your experience below. Your voice matters in this conversation. When we step back and look at the full picture, the Ethiopian manuscript, the Nag Hammadi texts, the archaeological evidence, the early inscriptions, a pattern becomes clear. A pattern of systematic historical revision, not conspiracy in the sense of a secret cabal meeting in dark rooms, but systematic institutional decisions that, over centuries, fundamentally changed how Christianity remembered its own origins. Let me show you how this worked. In the 1st and early 2nd centuries CE, Christianity was diverse. Multiple communities with different practices, different texts, different understandings of Jesus' message. Some emphasized faith and grace, like Paul. Some emphasized Jewish law observance, like James. Some emphasized mystical inner knowledge, like the Gnostic communities. Some emphasized women's leadership, as evidenced by numerous female deacons, prophets, and teachers mentioned in Paul's letters. This diversity is documented in the New Testament itself, in the disputes between Paul and other apostles, in the different theological emphases of different gospels, in the varied practices of different communities. But then, several things happened. First, as Christianity grew, institutional structures became more important. Leadership roles became more defined and hierarchical. And as this happened, women's leadership roles were progressively restricted. We can trace this in the texts themselves. Paul's authentic letters, 1 Corinthians, Romans, etc., from the 50s and 60s CE, mention women as deacons, apostles, and co-workers. But by the time of 1 Timothy, written in Paul's name but likely composed later in the early 2nd century, we find, "I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet." That's not theological evolution. That's institutional power consolidation. Second, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine in the 4th century, theological diversity became politically problematic. A unified empire needed a unified religion, so councils were convened, Nicaea, Constantinople, Ephesus, to define orthodox belief and condemn heretical alternatives. And here's the crucial point. These councils were convened by emperors and attended by bishops who were part of the imperial power structure. They weren't neutral theological gatherings, they were political events where powerful men decided which versions of Christianity would be permitted and which would be suppressed. Third, once orthodoxy was defined, texts supporting alternative views were systematically destroyed. This isn't speculation. We have imperial edicts ordering the destruction of heretical books. We have accounts of libraries being burned. We have records of Christians who possessed forbidden texts being executed. The Nag Hammadi texts survived only because someone buried them in the Egyptian desert, hiding them from destruction. The Ethiopian texts survived because they were geographically beyond the reach of imperial enforcement. But most alternative texts were lost forever, and with them we lost diverse memories of Christianity's origins, including memories of women's leadership, including memories of Mary Magdalene's apostolic role, including memories of more mystical, less institutional forms of Christian spirituality. Now here's what's important to understand. This process wasn't primarily about theology. It was about power. Texts that emphasized direct spiritual experience threatened the authority of clergy. Texts that showed women as teachers threatened patriarchal power structures. Texts that presented diverse paths to God threatened institutional monopoly on salvation. So those texts were labeled heretical and destroyed. Not because they were false, many contained traditions as old as the canonical Gospels, but because they were inconvenient. The Ethiopian manuscript describing Mary Magdalene is evidence of this suppression. It's a text that would have been destroyed in Europe, but was preserved in Africa. And its preservation shows us that the official Christian narrative we inherited isn't the complete story. It's one story, the one told by the winners. But other Christian communities had different stories, different memories, different truths, and some of those truths survived. Dr. Elaine Pagels, whose work on early Christianity has been groundbreaking, has written extensively about this process of historical revision. Her research demonstrates that much of what we think of as traditional Christianity was actually constructed through deliberate exclusion of alternative voices. The Ethiopian Mary Magdalene manuscript is one of those excluded voices, and it's speaking to us now across centuries of silence. What it's saying is uncomfortable. That history was written by those with institutional power, that what you were taught as the only Christian tradition was actually one version among many, that women's leadership in early Christianity was real, documented, and deliberately suppressed, and that recovering these lost memories isn't about destroying faith, it's about restoring historical truth. Something remarkable is happening in this historical moment, not just in academic circles or theological discussions, but across global culture, a questioning, a searching, a refusal to accept historical narratives at face value. And the Ethiopian manuscript describing Mary Magdalene is part of this larger awakening. Consider the timing. For 500 years, these alternative texts remained either buried or inaccessible to most people. The Nag Hammadi texts were discovered in 1945, but weren't widely translated until the 1970s. Ethiopian manuscripts existed, but were unstudied by international scholars until recently. Dead Sea Scrolls, Oxyrhynchus papyri, and other archaeological discoveries have only become accessible to general audiences in the last few decades. And now in the internet age, anyone can read these texts. Anyone can compare them to canonical scriptures. Anyone can ask, why were these voices silenced? This isn't coincidence. We're living in the first era of human history where information cannot be completely controlled by institutional gatekeepers, where suppressed texts can circulate freely, where alternative historical narratives can be examined by millions. And what's emerging from this democratization of knowledge is a more complex, more diverse, more truthful understanding of religious history, not to destroy faith, but to liberate it from the limitations of institutional control. Researchers like Dr. Karen King have noted that interest in alternative Christian texts has exploded in recent years, not primarily among academics, but among ordinary people seeking more authentic spirituality. People who feel that institutional religion has failed to address their spiritual questions. People who suspect that official narratives are incomplete or deliberately misleading. People who are discovering texts like the Gospel of Mary Magdalene and thinking, "This resonates with me in ways the traditional story never did." The Ethiopian manuscript is reaching audiences now because those audiences are ready to hear it, ready to question, ready to investigate, ready to reclaim spiritual authority that was taken from them. And Mary Magdalene has become a powerful symbol in this awakening, not because she's perfect or without controversy, but because her story represents something fundamental: the suppression of women's voices and women's spiritual authority. The institutional choice to prioritize power over truth, the deliberate erasure of inconvenient historical realities. When people discover that Mary Magdalene was likely an apostle and teacher, but was rewritten as a prostitute to diminish her authority, they recognize a pattern that extends beyond religious history into all areas where institutional power has controlled narratives. And they begin to ask, what else have we been told that isn't true? This questioning isn't cynicism, it's the opposite. It's a profound hunger for authentic truth, even when that truth challenges comfortable beliefs. The fact that you're watching this video, that you've stayed with this investigation for this long, indicates you're part of this awakening. You're someone who values truth over comfortable myths, evidence over inherited assumptions, honest questioning over blind acceptance. And you're not alone. According to research on religious trends, millions globally are seeking spirituality outside traditional institutional frameworks. They're reading ancient texts that were hidden for centuries. They're asking questions that previous generations couldn't ask. They're building communities of investigation and mutual discovery. The Ethiopian manuscript about Mary Magdalene is one thread in this larger tapestry of awakening. It's evidence that truth cannot be permanently suppressed, that voices that were silenced for centuries are being heard again, that we're recovering a more complete, more honest understanding of our spiritual heritage. This isn't about attacking Christianity or any faith tradition. It's about recognizing that within every tradition there are suppressed voices and lost histories that deserve to be recovered. Ethiopian Christianity preserved what European Christianity destroyed, and in doing so, they preserved a piece of truth that belongs to all humanity, a truth about a woman who stood at the cross when others fled, who was first to proclaim resurrection, who taught and led and carried the message forward, not despite being a woman, but as a fully empowered human being. That truth was buried for 700 years, but it's emerging now, and millions are ready to hear it. We've journeyed through an hour of evidence, textual, archaeological, artistic, historical. We've examined an Ethiopian manuscript that describes Mary Magdalene in ways that challenge everything you were taught. We've traced how one branch of Christianity preserved memories that another branch systematically destroyed. We've seen how institutional power shapes historical narratives and how those narratives can be recovered when we look beyond official sources. Now we arrive at the essential question: what does all this mean? Not just historically, but personally. For your understanding of faith, truth, and spiritual authority, the Ethiopian manuscript's description of Mary Magdalene isn't ultimately about one woman, however important she was. It's about a principle that early Christianity understood, but later Christianity forgot. That spiritual authority doesn't come from institutional position. It comes from direct encounter with the sacred. Mary Magdalene had that direct encounter. She walked with Jesus. She witnessed the crucifixion. She was first to see the resurrected Christ. Her authority came from her experience, not from being appointed by any council or institution. And that's precisely what made her dangerous. Because if authority comes from personal spiritual experience rather than institutional appointment, then anyone, man or woman, slave or free, educated or uneducated, can potentially have that authority. That's the message that was preserved in Ethiopian tradition and suppressed in European tradition, not because it was theologically wrong, but because it was institutionally threatening. The Ethiopian manuscript survived to tell us something important: that the official version of history is never the complete version, that marginalized voices and suppressed traditions contain truths that power structures don't want you to hear, that recovering those truths isn't about destroying faith, It's about expanding understanding. Mary Magdalene waited 1700 years for her voice to be heard again, but she's not alone. There are dozens, perhaps hundreds of figures in religious history whose stories were rewritten, minimized, or erased. Ethiopian Christianity preserved some of those stories, other traditions preserved others, and in this moment of historical awakening, they're all emerging, not to create chaos, but to restore balance, not to undermine truth, but to reveal more complete truth. What will you do with this knowledge? Will you dismiss it as merely academic, or will you recognize that recovering suppressed historical truths has real implications for how we understand authority, gender, spirituality, and power? The choice, as it always has been, is yours. But understand this: you're living in a unique moment, a moment when texts that were hidden for millennia are accessible with a few clicks, when scholars from marginalized traditions are finally being heard, when official narratives can be questioned and alternative evidence examined. This moment won't last forever. There are always forces that prefer simplified, controlled narratives to complex, challenging truths. But right now, the door is open. The manuscripts are being translated. The evidence is being examined. The suppressed voices are speaking. And you have the opportunity, the privilege, to listen. Mary Magdalene's story, as preserved in Ethiopian tradition, is one voice in a growing chorus. A chorus of historical witnesses who were silenced but not destroyed, marginalized but not erased, rewritten but not forgotten. They're speaking now. The question is, are you listening? Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future revelations. Don't miss the next video where we'll continue uncovering truths that have remained hidden for centuries. And if you truly feel called to go deeper, consider joining as a member. Our community is already accessing research and discussions we can never make fully public. Thanks for watching until the end. I'll see you in the next investigation. And remember, the forbidden truth can no longer be contained. The awakening is unstoppable, and you're part of it.